Welcome to the SportsPro podcast.
Hi everyone, and welcome once again to the SportsPro podcast. My name is Eoin Connolly. I'm the editor at large at SportsPro. Hope you're all well. Good to be back, and good to have back with me SportsPro editorial director Michael Long. Hi, Mike.
Hello, Owen. How are you?
I am okay, Mike. I'm okay. I'm getting used to the inside of my own house again, warming up for a long few weeks indoors. How are you?
Yeah, very well. Likewise, getting used to the same four walls, but it's keeping me warm. It's getting chilly outside, so cranking up the heating and staying safe, being well. Good to hear you are too.
Absolutely. The correct approach. And yeah, who wants to go outside anyway in November, December? We also have with us SportsPro Deputy Editor Sam Carp. Hi, Sam.
Hello, Owen. I was actually trying to remember the last time the three of us were on a podcast together, and I think it was in the first week of the first lockdown. So it almost feels appropriate that we're reconvening virtually, I should say, in the first week of the second lockdown.
There we go. We're not gonna run a check on that, but
No, please don't.
a nice unity to it, if that is the case. We're going to be hearing in the second half today from Joseph Hopkins from LTB Global about some changes in the world of broadcast production and distribution. Before that, it's a week of big news, some of which we've alluded to, some of which has not happened yet at the time of recording. But either way, we're not really in a position to comment. So what we're going to do instead is pick up on some sports industry stories that are just drifting along below the radar at the moment, but they could carry some real significance in the not too distant future. That is to come. First of all, Mike, we have a new issue of SportsPro magazine to talk about.
We do indeed, Owen. The final edition of 2020 for us, issue 111. If you haven't received your copy already, it should be coming to you very soon. And it's all about leadership, Owen.
It's also available digitally, no?
It is indeed, yeah. We, as we have done for the last couple of issues, since we entered lockdown and through the summer, we have been releasing each of the issues for free online. So do go to sportspromedia.com to access the latest issue and the previous two. But yeah, all about leadership, Owen. I know you've been speaking to Matt Rogan earlier this week about this very subject. And of course, Matt features once again in this issue of the magazine with the latest chapter of his forthcoming, soon-to-be released CEO Playbook, which is, of course, his personal guide for business leaders moving into the kind of post-COVID world and all its challenges. We've been serializing each of these chapters and the playbook in its entirety over recent weeks. Full release of that coming early 2021. But yeah, as I said, this issue themed around leadership, specifically voices of leadership, which is an interesting time to talk about leadership with the US presidential elections taking place kind of as we speak, late into the night here in the UK. But yeah, leadership and all it entails, really. Obviously, COVID has kind of been a test of many things, and leadership is one of those. So we're focusing on people within the sports industry who are kind of using their voice to change the conversation, to lead through action, not just words, to kind of speak up, have their say on a variety of issues, and most importantly, kind of make themselves heard. So Owen, the first piece in the magazine is actually one written by your good self, featuring ATP chairman Andrea Gaudenzi. Obviously coming to the end of his first year in the role. He's been kind of a vocal advocate for greater unity within tennis amid the pandemic, trying to create closer ties with the WTA on the women's side, also the ITF and the 4 Grand Slams. Elsewhere, also in tennis, been hearing from Sally Bolton, who appeared at SportsPro Live in, when was that? Was that September now? September. She's talking about becoming a pillar of the community, really, and leading through the pandemic in the absence of the Wimbledon that obviously the Wimbledon that never was this year. And then we've also got a couple of features towards the back of the mag, one on diversity in the workplace and increasing representation within the workplace in sports organisations. We'll have more coming on that kind of subject later in this year and heading into next year. Sam will be putting together a piece on athlete activism in the next issue of the magazine, obviously all tying in together with the BLM stuff this year and issues around race and social justice, particularly in the US. And then finally, we've got a piece written by our digital editor, Tom Bassam, on the business of podcasting. Excellent piece, goes into the ecosystem, sets the scene, where things stand in 2020. He hears from several people who are kind of using their voices to inspire people, to connect with people. Obviously, as we know, here we are speaking on a podcast. As you well know, Owen, podcasts are having a bit of a moment. If you want to kind of engage people in this kind of era of snackable throwaway content, you kind of release a video clip or you publish something online. But if you want to truly, connect with people on a bit of a deeper level, you produce a podcast, I would suggest. And, it's a growing medium. As I said, it's more intimate, attention based, relying on people's attention. People plug in, listen to up to an hour or more. I know I'm rambling now, but but no, the business of sports podcasting. So yeah, all about voice and leadership. So do check out the magazine if you get a chance, when you get a chance.
Yeah, absolutely do. Mike, you've written something in that as well, haven't you?
I have, Owen. I've overlooked myself there, haven't I? Yeah, I have spoken to Andrea Radrazani, who is the founder and chairman of Vesa Ventures, very well known within the industry as the kind of co-founder of MP and Silver, divested his interest from that agency a few years ago and has been spending his money on Leeds United, who are, of course, now a Premier League football club, 11 Sports, the international broadcaster. He's invested in other businesses like Whistle, One Football. He's established a new pay-per-view streaming platform called Live Now. So fingers in a few pies across sports, media, entertainment, technology. So he talks about his kind of, his career so far, his investment philosophy. That is now available also online across 2 parts. So do check that out if you so desire. But yeah, I have written something. I have been doing some work for this issue.
Right. Well, lots to review. All of it. Highly recommended. So yeah, SportsPro issue 111 is out now. Sam, what else? When people have read that and put that to one side, what are some of the stories that people might have lost focus on in this age of very much this moment of big news? What are some of the smaller at the moment stories that, if you tease the thread a bit, are going to lead us somewhere quite significant?
Yeah, well, I'm actually going to go really obscure here and go with a story which I think a lot of people might not necessarily have come across on our site. As you may know, Owen, I was off last week, so I wasn't quite keeping tabs on the digital side of things like I usually would. But one story that did actually catch my eye was one about the fan-controlled football league signing a deal with Twitch. Not necessarily the deal itself, but sort of the concept of this fan-controlled football. I'm sure a lot of people won't necessarily know exactly what fan-controlled football is, but the clue is very much in the name. Its inaugural season, I think, was meant to take place in the summer of this year, but like so many sporting events in 2020 had to be pushed back. So touch wood, it's going to be in February next year. It's basically a sort of new 7-on-7 format. Games are going to last an hour. Some of the team owners are big name current and former NFL players like Marshawn Lynch, Richard Sherman, which has naturally been quite good for building its profile. But I think obviously the most interesting thing about it is that I guess you could almost think of it like a sort of football manager simulation game brought to life. So it allows fans to, it's going to allow fans to call plays in real time. Users are able to influence team selection. I think this deal with Twitch is even going to see a sort of extension integrated that basically mirrors the play calling screen of Madden NFL, which is the video game that a lot of fans of American football will be very familiar with. So it's sort of immediately bringing that to the fore as well. So I mean, if ever it sounded like there was a sport that was almost purpose built for Twitch, this was this was probably it. And I think, it's an interesting one because we've been talking about gamification and sort of what influence it might have on sport for quite a long time. Well, I say a long time, the last couple of years, I suppose. And I think this is probably the first sports property looking to, truly fuse that sort of virtual gaming world with a real life sport. Fans having an influence on the action isn't something that is going to infiltrate the big established leagues, but we've seen from new properties like Formula E, for example, which has Fan Boost. That's a sort of tool which allows fans to vote for their favorite driver to receive a power burst during a race. We've seen from things like that these kind of fan engagement initiatives can be integrated successfully if it's there from the get-go. Yeah, so there's obviously that side of it, but also I think this sort of relationship with Twitch will be an interesting one to watch because we've seen a lot of sports put themselves on that platform. The NFL itself with Thursday night games, the NBA G League, numerous others like the NWSL, but fan-controlled football is obviously taking that to a whole new level. So I think it's going to be interesting to kind of track a new sport I say a new sports property that is native to the platform and, is actively looking to grow its community of fans on there. It's obviously not going to rival the NFL, but it will be interesting to see whether fans do take to it, how they engage with it, and if it can kind of attract that digitally native demographic that perhaps doesn't want to sit through a 3-hour NFL broadcast.
Yeah, the term that they're using to categorize themselves and to kind of explain what their pitch is immersive sports, which is we'll see if that catches on. But certainly, yeah, that those points about interactivity and certainly shared viewing and borrowing a little bit of the language of gaming broadcasts and so on, all of that stuff is going to be well worth watching. What do we have an idea what kind of a scale they are looking at for fan controlled football? How big an impact it could have in 21, or is this something that's going to be more interesting to kind of industry heads to begin with, and then it's perhaps the influence of it that we're tracking from there?
That's a very good question. I think based on the sort of profile of the people involved, I think initially, obviously, the first year is going to be interesting to track.
Can I share my thoughts on this? Because to me, it just sounds, it'd be interesting to watch for all the reasons that Sam explained, but it just feels quite gimmicky in the same way that Fan Boost did in Formula E. And you just wonder, whether they've perhaps misunderstood how or why people engage with a platform like Twitch or with sports in generally. Obviously the nature of fandom is changing, and these kinds of fan engagement initiatives, whether everything from a small tool to a kind of entire sport are increasingly coming to the fore. But you just get a feeling that, maybe traditional sports fans anyway would probably want to kind of leave the decision making to the coaches and to the managers. I mean, we all get pretty vexed when our chosen team doesn't pick the right team or make the right play. I just wonder how it's going to work in practice as well. Is it a case where, because obviously you've got multiple fans trying to call the plays, is it a kind of upvoting system where the play with the most votes gets selected? I don't know. I don't know enough about it, but I'm just, it feels a tad gimmicky. But yeah, worth a watch for sure.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from really when I'm asking about scale, because if you look at some of the things that have been tried in other sports, quite often it's an incentive to engage with the sport directly, or it kind of you're encouraging one kind of relationship that then makes other things slightly more viable. So if you look at Formula E, their path was from Fan Boost and kind of trying to create that reputation, and then trying to move on to stuff like the ghost racing that they did, where you could race in real time, or the idea is that eventually connectivity being powerful enough, you'll race in real time against the live on track drivers within games. I think it's definitely something that is going to lead somewhere, and quite what effect it has on mainstream sport is harder to ascertain. But I think there is definitely it's worth investors and probably rights holders and broadcasters and brands looking on, understanding how some of these spaces are going to work and understanding what the possibilities are for more interactive content.
You're listening to the SportsPro podcast.
Mike, anything that's caught your attention in the last few weeks or the last week or so?
Yeah, absolutely. So, obviously a few things, but I think one of the things that has stood out in the last, really going back a few months, really, kind of predates the pandemic that everyone is currently facing up to, but has really kind of taken on added significance in recent weeks and months, is the kind of relaxing of certain commercial inventory within the major leagues in the US and elsewhere. I think obviously we've been speaking for the last ever since kind of March, April, about things that have trends, or sorry, how COVID has accelerated certain trends that were already happening, and trying to identify things that will potentially outlive this current crisis. I think it is a sign of the times that you've got leagues like the NBA, as SVJ reported this week, kind of easing its rules on hard alcohol, casino and betting companies get involved in the sport. I mean, that's three categories right there that do we need that right now? Hard alcohol, casino and betting. But obviously the more unsavory, kind of less family friendly, certainly more addictive of all the sponsorship categories out there. We've seen the NFL relax its rules around gambling sponsorship back in February, I believe. Just this week, FanDuel and DC United of MLS announced that they're going to open a retail sportsbook at Audi Field in Washington, DC. So obviously there's this the encroachment of or the pervasiveness of gambling sponsorship within sport is now gathering pace on both sides of the Atlantic, and obviously, in many ways, as a commercial revenue stream, it's become very much essential. But you've got the financial imperatives of that need to kind of generate that revenue stream, kind of superseding the social and ethical considerations perhaps that go in around that. Just here in the UK, you've got the English Football League specifically saying, that gambling sponsorship is crucial to club survival in the wake of the pandemic. Obviously, they're looking to offset or make up for the shortfall in the absence of fans and mounting losses. But it's clear that not all money is good money. The government is cracking down on or considering, certainly reviewing whether to crack down on gambling sponsorships, not only in the UK here, but in countries like Spain. And meanwhile, you've got sports organisations kind of pushing for this, what they call a crucial revenue stream, and clearly it is a very pervasive revenue stream. But they're pushing for it, and meanwhile, clubs and leagues are asking for public bailouts and the need for money. So there's just this interesting dynamic within this whole situation. I'm sure you've got thoughts on it, Owen, where you've got kind of this need to generate money from wherever it may come, and this simultaneous kind of moment in time where really there is this broader discussion to be had about the kind of optics, for want of a better word, of kind of promoting gambling in a time of crisis, where many people are facing up to lack of social connection, job losses and all this kind of stuff. For me, it just seems like there's this incongruence to it all. Obviously, it's an issue that far kind of transcends the pandemic itself, and this year in particular. But it just, as the sports betting market does mature in the US, we're going to see more and more of this. And you just wonder whether, is this really about making up for a shortfall during the pandemic? When fans return, hopefully in future, and some of that, the traditional customary revenue returns, will the NBA really say, okay, we're gonna actually stiffen our rules again, and this isn't correct. That money's now coming in, they're going to want to keep it, aren't they? So you just, it's an area to watch clearly for the industry.
Yeah, I think what's going to be really telling is how much regulation keeps pace with it, or the interplay between regulation and sponsorship, the interplay between technology and kind of how multi-channel some of these sponsorships can get. I mean, one of the things, if you talk to some of the early movers in the States, particularly on the seller side, when it comes to betting sponsorship, talk about the potential of OTT and whether you can kind of take betting related messaging away from a mainstream audience, but you have it available for people who are interested in putting money on the outcome of a game or on aspects of a game. It's a really, really tough one, isn't it? And it's been notable, I think, pre-pandemic, and I know that particularly for lower reaches of certain sports, and there are sports where betting money is and betting sponsorship money is more makes up a bigger portion of revenues, but it has been interesting to watch betting companies kind of temper their messaging a bit. Perhaps, we're speaking purely from a UK perspective here, but trying to kind of own some of the arguments against itself. We've seen a lot more messaging around football matches that is related to problem gambling and being aware of problem gambling and better practices around gambling. There's been a lot less call to action. It hasn't gone away completely, but an awful lot of betting advertising around sports events was very, very call to action focused and kind of, here is the latest odds for this outcome, bet now. Seeing a bit less of that. We're still seeing branding everywhere. So, it will be interesting to see where that goes and where that dynamic goes. And I think not all of it is going to come from inside the industry. Not all of it is going to come from inside government or the betting sector. Some of it is going to come from studies that look into the effects of some of this shift in messaging. And I think it's going to be a very different picture on each side of the Atlantic, just because, you have a liberalizing market in the US and you have an established one in Western Europe and in other parts of the world. But it's a conversation that we've seen in other, related to other sectors. Obviously, tobacco sponsorship was a huge part of sport for generations. Fast food and alcohol sponsorship still is. But there's less of a direct revenue relationship with some sports in those areas than there is with betting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the bottom line is it's another area where sport and politics, sports organisations and governments are going to be at loggerheads, I'm sure, when it comes to money and who's picking up the tab, really. I suppose for all of these losses that are being accrued currently, have been accrued and will be accrued in future. I think there's a debate to be had there for sure. I think but as anything, any kind of debate that kind of spans ethics and kind of social responsibility as well, there is another dynamic to it. It's not all about money. So yeah, we'll see. No, I think it's certainly one to follow. And obviously alongside all this, you've got, meanwhile, kind of players looking to, perhaps it's unrelated and I've leapt a little bit, but players looking to sue the kind of gambling firms and data distributors over the use of their personal data. Project Red Card came to light months ago. Adds another layer to it. Where who's making the money, where's the money going, who deserves to own this data, and what's the money being used for. I think it's it's a fascinating discussion, and one we'll certainly be keeping tabs on.
We certainly will. Sam, any more?
I mean, not to go too off topic, but I just wanted, there was actually an interesting footnote in the SBJ, I say footnote, an interesting line in the SBJ report, which Mike mentioned before, kind of one of the things in terms of opening up new sort of revenue opportunities for the teams that the NBA is doing. Apparently they might let them create live digital content for sort of second screen news during match broadcasts that, doesn't feature game footage, such as, I guess one example that they used was in-arena halftime shows for a team's website or app, and using that as a really big segue to kind of something a little bit broader. I think it's just quite interesting, to see the way that leagues are starting to have to think a little bit differently the longer the absence of fans goes on. I'm not sure a lot of these leagues necessarily expected to be without a live audience for as long as they have been. Obviously the Premier League initially hoped to start having fans back in October, I think I'm right in saying.
Yeah.
And obviously for those sports that are indoors, it's going to be a little bit longer before they can have spectators as well. And I think it's just interesting. It's going to be interesting to see kind of towards the end of this year into the start of next year how leagues kind of get creative to retain their attention. I mean, I think it's been quite it's obviously been very well documented that TV ratings have gone down for a lot of sports. Obviously, that's for a multitude of reasons, including scheduling clashes, and naturally ratings are an anomaly this year for that reason. But I think it's also important to note that, the longer that fans aren't in stadiums, it might be a little bit harder to drum up that passion, to bring in that attention. And I think there was an interesting article in The Guardian written by Jonathan Liu, his most recent column, he spoke about, what's happening to sport without fans, but also what's happening to fans without sport. Are we, when we're watching, are we sort of becoming a little more numb to it? How can sport sort of capture that attention in the way they did when fans were in the arena without that kind of same sort of atmosphere around it? How are you going to build that sense of occasion? I think when sport returned kind of halfway through this year, there was obviously a lot made of kind of the broadcast innovations being rolled out, whether it was watch together features, chat functions, things like that. It's difficult to gauge exactly how successful they've been. And I just think the longer that absence of fans goes on, I think league is going to have to innovate even more to capture that attention that I was just talking about.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a really interesting dimension to this, because I think that there had very much been a revenue focus when it came to empty venues, because, as you said, most organisers did not expect fans to be away for quite as long as they have been, and it does all tie together. It's an engagement issue now rather than an income one. But I think the other thing that perhaps we hadn't mapped out when it came to anticipating the course of the pandemic and was the kind of certain, the tiers of normality that return to our lives from a full lockdown scenario to something where certain things are possible and certain things aren't. And I think you see it a little bit in communication and the kind of falling away of Zoom catch-ups and stuff, and the prioritization of what normal things that you can do. And sport, I guess, no longer has the luxury of pent-up demand, but it's still, I would say, it's still something that provides a little bit of forward momentum to life. So, but it's it's a slightly inferior. Well, it's a vastly inferior product without fans in the stadiums. Let's be honest, and it also lacks that kind of it lacks that kind of ability to generate interest around itself, as you say, Sam. Mike, was there anything that you had to add on that?
Yeah, I think it was one of the points that Jonathan Liu made in his column actually is the extent to which this absence from sport, from a fan perspective, has kind of been a bit of a leveler. People kind of becoming, aside from becoming kind of feral beasts, kind of spitting their vitriol through social media from a distance. But it's kind of a leveler in the sense that it's hard to differentiate between a season ticket holder who would ordinarily be going to Anfield every week versus a Liverpool fan based in Indonesia or Thailand or something, and they access to the same platforms. It's whoever shouts the loudest. People can just kind of spit things into the ether and just kind of ultimately the same credence or weight is almost given to those two fans, even though it removes geography from it. It removes kind of local allegiance to it and things like that. I think that dynamic. So yeah, I think what's happening to the fans in the absence of sport is a really interesting angle to consider. Yeah, and you just wonder whether the levels of engagement and things, how you go about how that fandom manifests itself. How fans look to show their allegiance to a team in future. Will it all be about going to the game again, or will it be about collective viewing online? Will it be about buying fan tokens and things for your club versus actually going and watching the team play? There's lots of different ways in which you can show your support for a team, and it just changes the whole dynamic, moving everything into a digital space. And from a club perspective, obviously it's and a league perspective, from a rights holder perspective, certainly people in the digital space have been saying for years that this, if you haven't got your full kind of ecosystem built out, then you weren't really prepared for this kind of shift. Then really you need to get your act together and make sure you can engage those fans worldwide, but also monetize them and make sure that they will be up for coming back once the doors reopen.
Yeah, and something Matt said in the podcast earlier this week was about stopping the idea that your physical audience and your broadcast or digital audience are separate, and start thinking about them in the round. But the other factor in all this is that we're not going to have the kind of snapback moment for the sports industry in any particular territory. We're going to have a gradual restoration of normality, and that will have its effects as well in the medium term. There's not going to be suddenly one day every football ground in the country is full again. It's going to be a longer process than that, and that will certainly have its effects. Right. Well, that was an interesting chat, guys. But I think we'll leave it there for part one. In part two, a few weeks ago, I spoke to Joseph Hopkins, who is the SVP of Corporate and Business Development at LTN Global. We discussed, among other things, the effects of COVID-19 on broadcast production and digital distribution, changes to production workflows with the advent of cloud infrastructure, LTN's partnerships with the likes of Turner Sports, and what we can expect in the sector through 2021 and 2022. That is all coming up just after this.
Help us spread the word about the SportsPro podcast. Subscribe, like and share our content on social. Join the conversation on Twitter with the hashtag SportsProPod. And if you're enjoying our work, why not leave us a rating and a nice review on your podcast platform of choice? And if you want to get in touch, you can send us an email, podcast@sportspromedia.com. The SportsPro podcast. We're listening too.
Joseph Hopkins, Senior Vice President of Business and Corporate Development at LTN Global. Welcome to the SportsPro podcast.
Thank you, Owen. It's great to be here.
Great to have you with us. And just to start with, Joseph, it would be great as well if we could get an introduction to LTN Global. What are some of the services that you guys offer? Where are you operating in the sports industry?
Yeah, good question. Good place to start. So, LTN is an integrated media technologies company. Really, we're a technology and engineering organization focused on helping the largest media and sports organizations simplify and scale the workflows around live content creation and content distribution across really all the ecosystems that exist today in the media landscape. We've organized the company internally into pillars, that address the four main segments of the workflows from our perspective, which is our create pillar, our command pillar, which is the create pillar is really about a white glove production around sports and news, both in terms of direct on site as well as the growing and ever popular remote style productions. Our command pillar is really about creating consoles and interfaces and systems that make it easier to manage the acquisition and production and distribution of content. Our third pillar is our signal pillar, which is designed to provide smart signaling for content. This is things like SCUDdy insertion, as well as other monitoring and failover systems. And then, of course, the backbone of the company is built on our transport pillar, which is the world's fastest and most reliable IP multicast transmission backbone, really a purpose-built broadcast network designed to move around at the same speed and reliability as as satellite, utilizing IP and effectively public internet, but with a lot of intellectual property and patented technology under the hood.
Who are you working with in the sports industry? Who are some of your partners and your target clients?
Yeah, well, in sport, so overall, we do about 50,000 hours of content daily in terms of transport. And I think that around 4,500 sports and live events annually. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about our relationship with Turner Sports. We've had a long-standing relationship with Turner. In fact, LTN and Turner go way back with CNN, utilizing a transport network to move feeds in and out of a CNN broadcast. But with Turner in particular, we've been really focused on utilizing our live video cloud to help them simplify and scale workflows of sort of non-traditional formats. So LTN serves Turner Sports as both a transport provider, utilizing the LTN transport network, but also utilizing our live video cloud platform. We bring feeds in. We talked about it on a panel that we did a few weeks ago with Troy Causey from Turner, who was very gracious, their VP of Sports Engineering. The way that we're utilizing our relationship with the NBA to bring feeds into the Turner ecosystem as well. And it really comes down to flexibility, speed, and scale when we're talking about the Turner relationship in terms of being able to pull in feeds from any number of locations, regardless of the protocol, regardless of the device that's contributing. These include things like SRT and RTMP and, of course, LTN sources, and give them a single dashboard where they can monitor and manage these complicated workflows. We helped with pulling in a high volume of pre-conferences, post-conferences for the NBA season and for this postseason, and helping them scale distribution into various partner ecosystems and so forth as well.
That kind of approach, I guess, is something that we're going to see extending to different parts of the broadcast production sector. But in the shorter term, what have the effects of recent months of the pandemic been on broadcast production and distribution?
Yeah, good. This is a really good question. I think a lot of folks are probably interested in hearing how we've been dealing with some of these pandemic challenges. And we've really seen it across a number of sectors, both major media organizations. I mentioned our work with Turner, but also working on shows like American Idol, across digital native and esports platforms. We talked early in the year about the work we were doing with EA Sports and remote productions with Madden. But for us, it's really introduced the necessity for flexibility when it comes to creating content and producing content. I think a lot of folks were scrambling because a lot of the systems that are traditionally used for content creation and production are hardware based, and it really forced people to think outside the box in terms of utilizing software systems, utilizing cloud-based technologies. We talk a lot about how this pandemic has probably accelerated cloud-based technologies by at least 5 years. But the biggest thing I think is moving from hardware-based systems to more software-based workflows during this pandemic. We saw it in the work that we did around the NFL draft. On the run-up to the draft, there was a lot of concern. Of course, it's one of the biggest events that fans are participating in. And when COVID hit and everyone was forced to stay at home, we had to find a new way to get those fans involved. And so we leveraged our live video cloud to pull in more than 600 fans who were stuck at home, as all of us were, to become contributors to the show. We worked with a number of folks at Famous Group and Quince and great folks at DTags, who we now have become part of the LTN family, to produce custom looks and sort of branded images that matched each team's logo. And then we divided those fans into different groups depending upon the team they were supporting. And as each group went on the clock, they became an option for the switcher to switch in and come in behind Roger Goodell and become a part of the show. And that was a big change. And since then, we've seen some of the work we did on some live shows. We were also able to use that same type of workflow and technology for the Democratic National Convention. Again, the notion that folks are stuck at home, they want to be a part of the show. And we've seen this trend for a number of years, thanks to platforms like Instagram and Facebook and others, where consumers have really learned to go live on their own. And the data shows that they want to go live with the brands that they love. But until the pandemic hit, technologies like Live Video Cloud, Zoom, and many others, really weren't leveraged for that purpose. And so when the pandemic hit, we had to take a step back, look at our technology and say, given the circumstances, what more could we be doing with these capabilities? And the virtual audience and the fan participation were two big ones for us that we think will have legs even after this COVID pandemic has ended, because like I mentioned before, there's a lot of excitement and desire for fans to be part of the content creation process with the brands that they love, and we now have a means to do that.
Yeah, and obviously we've heard that a lot in different sectors, but it feels like it's particularly pronounced in broadcast production and in media distribution, where trends have been accelerated because teams have been forced to work remotely and perhaps putting their confidence in platforms that they were perhaps looking at from more of an R&D perspective up until 2020. Perhaps it was something they thought of they thought was going to become a big part of what they were doing in kind of 22 or 23. But what are some of the other ways in which broadcast workflows are changing, and what role is technology playing in that?
Well, I think this pandemic has also shined a light on the limitations of satellite-based workflows, right? We talk a lot about the volume of either virtual audiences or fan cams, but also I think as we've been pushed more in the direction of these cloud-based technologies, it's starting to unlock the promise of the cloud. And I think you're right that 2022, 2023 timeframe was when we thought folks would start to dip their toe in the waters of things like AI and other machine learning capabilities. And now, as these workflows start to move to more software-defined environments, those things are becoming options. And so, as we think about moving to the cloud, it's really about flexibility. There are some challenges though with moving to the cloud, right? There's some inherent cost challenges with distribution. And so what we're trying to find is an environment or create an environment where you can unlock the advantages of the cloud. You can utilize the cloud for the components that you need in terms of flexibility and augmenting your workflows. But you can also leverage purpose-built environments like our LTN transport network if you have a large distribution footprint, because egress costs coming out of the cloud to dozens or hundreds of locations can be cost prohibitive. And so really what we're trying to find is this good balance between hardened, trusted ecosystems that are interconnected with the cloud. We announced a couple of weeks ago our partnership with Amazon in terms of being able to move feeds seamlessly in and out of Amazon's cloud. And this is really the purpose and the focus for us in doing so.
I mean, you talk about the cloud there, and that's a big shift. Again, it's one that some broadcasters have been looking at getting ahead of, even before they were pushed into kind of having teams working remotely and so on. What are some of the other opportunities for broadcasters and for media distributors in switching to cloud infrastructure? And what are some of the challenges? What are some of the obstacles they're going to have to get over to do that effectively?
Yeah, well, I think the advantages are flexibility. I mentioned that in terms of being able to acquire a broader range of signal types from different device types. That's one big advantage. Of course, we talk a lot about, so long as it doesn't impact latency or create drift or other challenges, being able to unlock other kinds of services like AI and machine learning, automated captions creation, scaling distribution. But there are a number of challenges, as you mentioned. A lot of them include cost, include just general uptime and reliability. It's still a relatively unproven environment. And a lot of these systems are just running on instances in the cloud with limited ability to monitor. And so we've got a big focus internally on the ability to monitor more of these software ecosystems, as opposed to traditionally monitoring any individual piece of hardware, but really monitoring an ecosystem of tools or a solution set to better understand if there is a challenge somewhere. What are all the systems downstream of that are impacted, to try to insert some reliability and improve reliability to the broadcast level that we're used to or known for. But like I said, I think cost is a big one in terms of certain egress components or running certain tools in the cloud, especially as we move towards 4K workflows.
How much is there an education piece around this, and what do media companies need to be aware of in terms of how digital distribution and consumption are changing what they need to deliver?
Well, I mean, in terms of changing what they need to deliver, I think it's really about efficiency and utilizing, cloud-based tools and software systems that can create efficiencies in their workflows. I think there's both a lot of these larger media companies and sports broadcasters and sports leagues and so forth are looking for ways to more efficiently manage both their linear distribution and their digital distribution. And I think the cloud represents, and these tools represent, an ability to sort of consolidate in many ways these workflows, to remain agile. So I don't really want to answer the question in terms of the formats, because it's not really our place in the ecosystem to talk about digital formats, but it's really more about just creating more software-defined environments that can scale to meet like this broad variety of required workflows, right? So it'd be nice, I guess, in a perfect world, you'd have a dashboard where you can manage not only your SRT and your wrist workflows, your LTN workflows, but also these fan cam environments or these virtual audience environments. So I think the innovation that we foresee in cloud workflows is really about creating efficiency and scale and keeping a close eye on operating expenses and costs.
No, you talked about a bit earlier about the session you did at SportsPro Live with Turner Sports and their NBA output. Are you able to walk us through a little bit how it is that you structure these partnerships, how it is that you integrate yourselves with what they're doing and bring them on board with the possibilities of what you're doing?
Well, yeah, I think Turner is a great example of where we want to go as a company in terms of unifying these workflows, right? We mentioned before that they're a fan and user of the LTN transport network. They've seen firsthand the reliability and quality and speed of the network getting feeds in and out of Techwood facilities. They have challenges internally, like every other organization, of different groups within the business having to interact with one another. So calling into the TOC and calling into the NOC and requesting sources, and having folks, spin up digital sources, and finding efficient ways to hand back and forth those URLs and spreadsheets and all these things. And one of the things that we've been focused on through Live Video Cloud is really simplifying and unifying a dashboard or an environment that would give them the flexibility to stand up and spin up and spin down workflows, literally drag and drop inputs into outputs that are pre-configured to go to any number of destinations, transform, transcode, repackage, whatever we have to do to those sources, record all those sources in a location where they can utilize them later or move them into other kind of highlight or clipping ecosystems, connect a number of digital partners. Oftentimes we serve as kind of a digital hub, and that's also the case with Turner and the work that we're doing with the NBA, where we can be that center hub and connect. If you talk about one of the challenges of the cloud, it's that there's a lot of great point systems out there, but that's really what they are. Is they're designed to do a single task or provide a set of features. And what we're trying to do is create an environment where you can have a central hub and route those feeds into those partners to be able to do those things, but still maintain a monitoring dashboard and be able to configure and monitor and manage all those workflows without having to go through 10 different screens or swivel chair or have to log into multiple systems. And so APIs and flexibility and so forth are very important.
Okay. Now we've talked about the way that that COVID has brought certain developments forward. So what has that done to the sector, and what kind of change can you then foresee over the next couple of years? Is it going to be a consolidation of some of these ways of doing things, or are we going to start to see some other technologies now being brought forward in their development as a result of what we've seen over the last few months?
Sure. So I think one of the biggest innovations over the last year or so, I think there's two big ones. One is in transport efficiency and reliability. We talk a lot about the LTN transport network. We're very proud of its history and of its performance, but we also support SRT. We also support WRIST, which is a fast growing internet transport technology. And so I think what we'll see is, probably a lot of innovation around the transport, the reliability, and so forth, as it relates to those transport protocols. A lot more support around 4K type of workflows, but a lot of challenges associated with that, of course, with I/O and CPU and a number of things within the cloud. I think we'll see a lot of innovation around cloud-based production suites. So I know VizRT and the NewTek folks have now moved to a cloud-based instance of that. Grass Valley has a cloud-based kind of master control. And so I think we're going to continue to see the evolution of master control moving more into the cloud and into these software type of systems. And I also think you're going to see a lot more REMI style production. So it's not always going to be just cloud that's innovating. I think we're seeing a big push toward remote production and getting we've seen it for a number of years, right, where budgets are being constrained with certain level of sports content, so rolling a truck perhaps doesn't make sense from a budget perspective. So being able to home run those sources using a reliable transport tool and utilizing the internet for that transport, and then having crews in remote locations producing kind of the morning set of games as well as the afternoon and potentially evening games without having to put anybody or much fewer folks at the location.
Okay, thanks very much, Joseph.
Yeah, thank you, Owen. We really appreciate the opportunity, and keep up the good work.
Join the conversation with the SportsPro community. Follow us on Twitter @SportsPro. Find us on Instagram @sportspro.media. And connect to SportsPro Media on LinkedIn, where you can also become a part of our specialist OTT community. SportsPro, connecting and inspiring the business world of sport.
Okay, that is it for another SportsPro podcast. Thank you to Joseph Hopkins for his time there. Thank you to Michael Long.
Always a pleasure, Owen. Thank you.
Always a pleasure indeed. Thanks to Sam Carp.
Cheers, Owen. Cheers, Mike.
And most importantly of all, thanks to all of you for listening. We'll be back with you again very soon. Bye-bye.
The SportsPro podcast is published by SportsPro Media. The producer is Ed Dixon.